Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have
Matt Shillito, acting director in the Special Projects Office at the City of Vancouver.
And he's with us today because we're talking about the Broadway Plan, which is a major new plan to, well, he's going to explain in better detail than I ever would, but basically it's a way to completely redesign, in a way, the Broadway corridor, which is one of the busiest areas in Canada in terms of traffic and in terms of business and residential area. But let's go into that. I guess housing affordability is a key concern all over Vancouver, but specifically to the Broadway Plan, how does it address housing affordability in the greater Vancouver area?
Yeah, thanks, Warren. It's a really key issue, as you say, in the city and in the region, and no different in the Broadway corridor. The plan tackles it head on, and I'd say, in summary, there are sort of three main things that the plan is doing. The first is, and perhaps the most important, is it's introducing significant amount of more supply of housing of all kinds, all tenures, and all kinds of forms of housing, but with a particular focus on rental and affordable housing. About 2/3 of the plan will be rental and affordable housing, and about 1/3 strata condos. So we're estimating around 30,000 new homes will be built over the next 30 years through the plan. And so that supply is really crucial because we know that we have high and rising prices for the sale of homes, and we also have very low rental vacancy rates. So first thing we need to do is to increase the supply and help address that. The second thing around housing affordability is that within the Broadway Plan area, we have some large areas of existing relatively affordable apartments. They're mainly the sort of 3- and 4-story walk-up apartments that were built in basically between the 1950s and the 1970s. And so that is a really essential stock of affordable housing that we have in the city, and we need to protect that. And so the plan looks to focus development away from those areas and into the other areas around the stations and along the main streets, and thereby only allow incremental development of that rental stock over the long term. And then that takes me sort of to the third point, which is that the tenants of those homes also need to be looked after as those buildings do age and as they redevelop. So while we're putting the development pressure elsewhere, we know and we want to create an opportunity for redevelopment of those buildings as they age. But in doing so, we've put in tenant protections to ensure that existing tenants have an opportunity to return to the new building at affordable rents that are at or below their current rents. So those are the three areas really: supply, safeguarding the existing rental stock, and by extension, safeguarding the tenants of that stock.
Okay, and before I go any further, I live in Vancouver, so I know what Broadway corridor is, but I was thinking to myself, a listener in Toronto or Idaho doesn't have any idea what the Broadway corridor is, so we should probably explain what that is before we go any further.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an area of about 500 blocks of the city. It stretches east-west from Clark Drive in the east to Vine Street in the west, and it wraps itself around an extension to the Millennium Line subway, where we're in the process of building an extension to the subway, including 6 new stations. And so it's a east-west corridor right in the center of the city of Vancouver, and therefore obviously right in the center of the region around that new subway.
Okay, and what are some other areas of the city of Vancouver would like to address or fix via the Broadway Plan? Like, for instance, I know densification is important and carbon reduction. We have very ambitious carbon reduction goals. So how does this tie into that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the key things that we're trying to do within this Broadway corridor plan is encourage people to use sustainable modes of transportation. In other words, to leave their cars at home and walk, use their bikes, micro-mobility, and obviously take the transit, which is going to improve significantly when the subway opens. So we have a goal as part of our climate emergency action plan to for 80% of trips from the area, from the corridor, to be by those sustainable modes of transit and not by the car. We also have, as part of wider work that we're doing, very high and increasing standards around green buildings. So reducing the embodied and the operating emissions involved in buildings, And yeah, so those are probably the two main things: getting people out of their cars in favor of sustainable transportation, and reducing the carbon footprint in our built form in our buildings.
And I know, and with other developments, I've seen this happen where there's a centering around Oak Ridge, for instance. There's a centering around the Skytrain station, and Marine Drive, I think, does that too. So I assume there's sort of the same philosophy at work here, where a lot of stuff is centered around the Skytrain stations.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. We have in the Broadway plan a number of different character areas, and one of them is what we call the centers, and that is the station areas. So that's the blocks immediately around the stations within a few minutes walk of the station, and also along the main streets, Broadway itself, but also Cambie, Main Street, Kingsway, Burrard, and Arbutus, where we are looking to put the most density. And really that's, yeah, to support transit ridership, and also as back to the earlier point about avoiding development pressure in some of the existing apartment areas where we want to allow that to happen incrementally. So yeah, the highest densities, the tallest buildings are all within a very short walk of the new stations.
Okay, and from a logistics point of view, how difficult will the construction process be, given it's already fairly populated, home to existing residential buildings, and it's one of the busiest traffic corridors in Canada? For instance, with the Broadway Skytrain line, I know when I go to that area where it's being built, it's taking up a lot of space. So I would assume this is that you have to deal with the same issues.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important point, Warren. And actually, one of the things about the timing of doing the plan and completing the plan around the timing of the construction of the subway itself is something that we've had to kind of wrestle with. And I think that we've got the timing about right. The danger is if you start the planning process, the land use planning process, too early, and then you enable a whole load of development to happen as a result of that process, and then that does conflict with the completion of the subway. As it is, we still have a further step of process to go through, which in most cases, which will be a rezoning application. So it'll be a couple of years before we start to see construction related to the plan. And by that time, the subway construction will be almost complete, be complete by the end of 2025. But yeah, there's a lot of pressure on streets space for servicing, for construction laydown areas and so on. And so we want to get through the bulk and the biggest footprint and the biggest impact of the subway construction complete before we unleash a considerable amount of new construction for the plan. So we've had to, it's partly in timing, and then it's partly in our engineering department working with the subway builders and with the developers to coordinate those things. And we will have to hold back development under the plan, and in some cases until that subway construction is complete.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Vancouver plan is similar but more expansive. It's not approved by council yet. By the time this goes to air, it may have been or it may not have been. But I know, given that there's only so much you can talk about. But how do the Broadway plan, the proposed Vancouver plan, sort of dovetail in the way their goals for the city?
Yeah, well, they really have very similar goals. And the Broadway plan, what's interesting about it is because it's such a large area, it kind of encapsulates all of the city planning kind of challenges and opportunities that we have in Vancouver. And so by extension, the Vancouver plan is wrestling with those same challenges and has the same goals. And so housing supply and affordability is a key one. We haven't talked much about jobs and an employment space, but that's a really important point in Broadway and in the Vancouver plan as well. So that means diversifying and again increasing the supply of job space, so offices, commercial space, hotels, safeguarding our industrial lands, diversifying what you can build in our industrial lands. Those are sort of twin goals of the two plans. Climate we've touched on. Vancouver plan has the same goals around that. Also, there's a big theme of equity and reconciliation in both plans, trying to make the city more equitable for all, and also trying to make some really tangible steps towards reconciliation with First Nations. So those are themes that run through both plans. And then I think the final thing I'd say in terms of common goals is one around livability. And that means a whole variety of different things. But one of the key things in both plans is finding ways to fund and deliver the public amenities that are needed to support the growth that we know is coming. So that's things like parks and community centers and childcare and so on, that are these kind of really essential amenities that support a growing population. So I'd say they're very much common goals. They obviously work at different geographical scales, and so the Vancouver plan is a higher level, less detailed kind of framework, more strategic plan, whereas the Broadway plan gets very specific about specific change, heights, and land uses, densities of development within the corridor. But it fits within one of the rapid transit areas in the Vancouver plan, and essentially is a kind of model of how one particular rapid transit area would look in the city. So that's kind of how they fit together.
And what were the origins of the Broadway plan? Was it the Skytrain first, and then this came from that, or are they developed separate? How'd that all work out?
Yeah, exactly. The Skytrain decision and the commitment to that was the initiative for it. Once we had that, we knew it was important to do a land use plan for the area, but it was important to have that commitment first. But yeah, the genesis and the rationale for the Broadway plan is absolutely founded on the subway extension.
Okay, and what are the next steps in terms, like, it's been approved, but now I'm sure there's much more and a lot of it behind the scenes before anything goes forward. So what are the next steps in terms of what the city has to do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's occupying us a lot now, a week after the plan was approved. We have a substantial plan implementation phase. I mean, really, it's a 30-year plan, so it will continue for that whole period. But we have a list of priority items to work on. One thing that we know will happen soon when the plan comes into effect in September is we will start receiving rezoning applications from applicants. So considering those, reviewing them, and reporting them to council is one major element of the implementation. But we are also going to look at the existing zoning and potentially make changes to some of it to enable some of the plan goals. We have a whole series of large sites in the plan area. There are 8 large sites, all of which need to be master planned and brought through a process, a major projects process and rezonings. We've got various bits of work to do on active transportation. So looking again at walking, biking, and use of transit. So introducing bike lanes and greenways and plazas and pocket parks and things. So a lot of work in the public realm, in the streetscape to make that improved. We've got the design and the planning and the implementation of all of those public amenities that I mentioned over the course of the plan. We've got some follow-up work to do on heritage, so retaining a more detailed heritage strategy to retain heritage buildings. And all of this involving engagement with members of the public, with businesses, with community as a whole, and most importantly, or as importantly, equally importantly, with First Nations. So furthering our work with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations to ensure that they are really engaged in all of the tangible things that happen as the plan gets implemented. So it's a much longer list than that, but that's a good example of a few things that we need to be getting on with immediately.
Okay, and City of Vancouver is usually quite good about this. If people want more information on the plan, where do they go for more details?
If you go to our website, vancouver.ca, and you'll click on the planning department's link, and then we're under the major projects web page, and that you'll find a whole host of information about the Broadway plan, the whole process we've been through, all the documents that have been produced along the way, and then obviously the final plan itself.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
You're welcome. Thanks, Warren.